Hello learners, we have discussed the concept of indigenous people, the characteristics of indigenous people, and let us also discuss the relationship between indigenous people and international bodies, and what is the take on the indigenous people, and also we will discuss the relationship between India and indigenous people and what is their take on indigenous people. So, few other topics what we are going to discuss in this unit are International Labour Organization and indigenous people, World Bank and indigenous people, United Nations and indigenous people, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and we will also discuss in detail the relationship of India and indigenous people, and the focus is on tribal people versus indigenous people. Here we are going to discuss what are the argument for the tribes as indigenous people and also what are the argument against the tribes as indigenous people. Now let us discuss the relationship between indigenous people and international bodies. We all know that it has been widely acknowledged that the indigenous people are socially discriminated, economically exploited and politically marginalized. They have been experiencing different forms and magnitude of discrimination and marginalization in their respective social context. They have been witnessing the increasing evidence of non-recognition of their identity and growing erosion of their culture and other rights with the initiation of nation building process in different parts of the globe. So, to put it differently, we can say that the history of the indigenous people is one of marginalization, discrimination and subjugation. And if you see the nature of the problems of indigenous people, different international organizations and institutions have initiated their efforts to address the growing problems of the indigenous people across the globe, which can be discussed in the following ways. Now let us look at what the International Labour Organization say about indigenous people. The International Labour Organization was the first international body to work on the issues of indigenous people. The ILO started to work on the issue of indigeneity since its inception in 1920s. In 1926, it enacted number of conventions and recommendations related to forced labour and recruitment process of indigenous people. It adopted the convention concerning the protection and integration of indigenous and other tribal and semi-tribal populations in independent countries, which work towards the promotion of social and economic conditions of the indigenous people. This convention first speaks of tribal and semi-tribal populations and then of indigenous population as a population of special category analogous to the tribal and semi-tribal population. The members of tribal and semi-tribal social formations are, according to Article 1A of the Convention, population whose social and economic conditions are at a less advanced stage than the stage reached by the other sections of the national community, and whose status is regulated wholly or partially by their own customs or by special laws and regulations. Article 1B speaks of members of tribal and semi-tribal populations in independent countries which are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from the population which inhabited the country or a geographical region to which the country belonged at the time of conquest of colonization, and which, irrespective of their legal status, live more in conformity with the social, economic and cultural institutions of that time with the institutions of the nation to which they belong. The Convention 107 of the ILO interpreted the indigenous people as the tribal or semi-tribal populations of a special category who inhabit a particular geographic region and have a specific historical experience. So this was the first international instrument which addressed the situation of indigenous people. This was the first international instrument which addressed the situation of indigenous people as a separate category from non-self-governing territories or minorities. In other words, It applies only to economically and culturally distinct groups living within the borders of the independent states in particular. The interpretation of Convention of 107 has not been abrogated, but is in the process of being supplanted by the definition in the ILO Convention 169. The Convention 169 of the ILO on Indigenous and Tribal People affirms that no state or social group has the right to deny the identity to which an indigenous people may lay claim, and places responsibility on states for ensuring with the participation of indigenous people their rights and dignity. Article 13 of the Convention 169 states that in applying the provisions of the Convention, governments shall respect importance of their cultures and spiritual values of the people concerned of their relationship with the lands or territories or both as applicable which they occupy or otherwise use, and in particular the collective aspects of this relationship. In other words, this convention recognizes the distinct cultural traditions of indigenous and tribal people and places them on equal footing in terms of their contribution to the world's culture. Now let us see the relationship of World Bank and indigenous people. If we look at the historical relationships between the World Bank and indigenous people, have often been tense and characterized by lack of trust. This is because of the serious negative social and cultural impact inflicted upon the indigenous communities by past World Bank financed infrastructure, extractive and industrial projects. Most of the World Bank projects did not involve the indigenous communities in the formulation as well as implementation of the projects. The engagement between the World Bank and the indigenous people happened for the first time in the year 1987, at a time when the new World Bank president Barbara Conable had finally admitted that many of its projects had resulted in negative impact on indigenous people and their environment. So to put it differently, the World Bank recognizes the vulnerabilities and risks that indigenous people encounter in development interventions. It has also developed safeguard policies to ensure that the development projects it supports that will take place in indigenous lands or territories only if the affected indigenous people are consulted and participate. And let us now look at the United Nations and their relationship with the indigenous people. Over the decades, the UN has become the pivotal forum where indigenous people's rights are given shape and expressed in declarations, covenants and other instruments. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN in 1948, where Article 22 and 25 set forth the seminal protection of economic, social and cultural rights of all human beings. And there was a major turning point which emerged in the year 1970, when the UN Human Rights Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities emphasized the need of detailed study on the discrimination of indigenous people by appointing Martinez Cobb as a special rapporteur to conduct a broad study on the problem of discrimination against indigenous people. This commission recommended for different national and international measures for eliminating discrimination against indigenous people. The report also addressed different range of human rights problems, which included the definition of indigenous people, the role of intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, the elimination of discrimination and basic human rights principles, as well as special areas of actions in the field such as health, housing, education, language, culture, social and legal institutions, employment, land, political rights, religious rights and practices, and equality in the administration of justice and realization of their rights. The subcommission also created the UN Working Group on Indigenous Population in the year 1982, which focused on the issues related to indigenous rights within the UN system. The working group prepared a draft declaration on the rights of indigenous people and submitted to the UN for consideration. The preamble of the draft stated that all indigenous people are free and equal in dignity and rights. It also emphasized that there is an urgent need to respect and promote the rights and characteristics of indigenous people, especially their rights to land, territories and resources which stem from their history, philosophy, cultures, spiritual and other traditions, as well as from their political, economic and social structures. The draft's operative paragraph proclaims that the indigenous people have the right to be protected from genocide. They have the right to maintain their distinct ethnic and cultural identities. They have their right to use their own languages. They also have their right to own and control their tradition and also be consulted on development projects affecting them, and also they have the right to participate on equal footing in political, economic, social and cultural life. With this broader framework, the UN General Assembly on December 18, 1990 adopted resolution and proclaimed the year 1993 as the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. The Indigenous Peoples Year called for a new partnership to be created among indigenous people, governments and UN, and it was expected that this will help to address their needs, promote an understanding of their cultures and incorporate indigenous communities into the decision making process. It also aimed to strengthen international cooperation for the solution of problems faced by indigenous people in the areas of human rights, environment, development, education and health. So, to encourage the new partnership, the year stressed on the need to foster participation of indigenous people in the planning, implementation and evaluation of projects affecting their future and living conditions. Knowledge about international standards developed over the past several decades by UN bodies for protecting the rights of indigenous people. Public awareness of the situation of the indigenous people and the threat to their existence through special observances, meetings and other promotional and cultural activities as well as media coverage. Besides these, UN General Assembly in its resolution of December 21, 1993 has proclaimed the International Decade of the World's Indigenous People from the year 1994 to 2004. Now, let us see the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. With an overwhelming majority of 143 votes in favor, only 4 negative votes and 11 abstentions, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People on September 13, 2007. Les Malzer, Chair of the International Indigenous People Caucus, welcomed the adoption of the Declaration in a statement to the General Assembly. The Declaration does not represent solely the viewpoint of the United Nations, nor does it represent solely the viewpoint of the indigenous people. It is a declaration which combines our views and interests and which set the framework for the future. It is a tool for peace and justice based upon mutual recognition and mutual respect. The declaration emphasizes the right of indigenous people to maintain and strengthen their own institutions, cultures and traditions, and to pursue their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs. It recognizes putative international norms and evolving human rights standards pertaining to indigenous people. While some of the rights elaborated in the text do not constitute accepted legal standards, the genesis of the declaration was the need to arrest the protection gap that exists in international human rights law in relation to indigenous people. Now, we are moving on to the next topic, how India looks at the indigenous people, the tribal people versus indigenous people. After examining the issue of indigenous people in Indian context, the pertinent question needs to be asked is whether the term indigenous people could at all be considered applicable in the Indian context. If the answer is affirmative, is it possible to consider all the tribal communities of India as indigenous people? India has constitutionally recognized tribal people or scheduled tribe, but the concept tribe is not defined anywhere in the Indian constitution. But it states in Article 342 that the scheduled tribes are tribes or tribal communities or parts of or groups within tribes or tribal communities, which the President may specify from time to time by public notification. The tribals in India are also referred to and refer to themselves as Adivasis, a Sanskrit deviation meaning original settlers. In other words, the indigenous people. To put it differently, the term Adivasi, Adi means oldest and Vasi means inhabitant. So this is commonly used to designate them. The ILO Convention 107 held at Geneva on June 5th in the year 1957 classified these people as indigenous. The World Bank also considers that the indigenous people mean scheduled tribes in India. So both the concepts STs and indigenous people have been used interchangeably in India. There are different views which have been emerging to take different position on the question of indigeneity. The indigenous question in India seems to be problematic as the indigenous people of India have difficulties in gaining adequate recognition. In some regions, cultural, social and physical features commonly associated with indigenousness are absent or hard to recognize, or indigenous as a concept is rejected or contested by the Indian state. The struggle of indigenous people for recognition and protecting their rights ranges from resisting subjugation, territorial acquisition, resource exploitation, the destruction of tradition and infringement of customs and lifestyles, to fighting inhuman treatment, abuse and deprivation of human rights. Now let us see what are the arguments for the tribes as indigenous people. In the year 1993, Ram Dayal Munda, the President of Indian Council of Indigenous and Tribal People, conceded in the forum of the UN that all tribal communities of India as whole are indigenous, where he stated that in the Indian context, unless definitionally specified, everyone could be called indigenous after the British colonizers left the country in 1947. Independent India is developing indigenous locomotives, indigenous rockets and so on. Non-specification of the term has led to our government's refusal to equate the scheduled tribes with a working group intended for indigenous people. Consistently, if you see during the last 7 years, the term tribal people, though considered somewhat pejorative among Indo-European speaking countries, is relatively more acceptable in India for this purpose. Proceeding further, he said, we therefore strongly suggest that the expression indigenous and tribal people form a single segment when it comes to defining the people concerned, particularly in the Indian and Asian context. In the present context, the issue of marginalization and discrimination are built upon the definition of indigenous people. Only those people that have been subject to domination and subjugation have come to constitute the component of indigenous people. In this context, the tribal communities of India can be considered as indigenous people since they have experienced different forms of marginalization, subjugation and discrimination for centuries. They have been the victims of conquest and colonization and hence share all the attributes of colonized people such as ethnic identity, loss of control over customary, territorial resources, cultural annihilation and powerlessness. The tribes remained outside the politico-administrative structure of the larger society. In this context, in order to integrate the tribal communities, the Government of India favoured the concept of indigenous people deliberated in the Convention 107 of 1957 due to the fact that the convention had articulated the need of integrating the indigenous and tribal people into the larger social and political structure. Zaxa argues that the root cause of the tribals' demand for indigenous people status is their complete loss of power over natural resources. This demand is based on the extreme discrimination faced by tribal communities and their many experiences of dispossession by the dominant groups. Even the most cursory consideration of this history of discrimination and dispossession against tribal people demonstrates the degree to which they are denied the rights enjoyed by other groups constituting dominant sections of the society. To put it differently, By using the legal concept of indigenous people and indigenous rights, they seek recognition for their collective rights to land and their livelihood strategies within state structures that otherwise systematically discriminate against them. In this context, the tribal communities of India can be considered as indigenous people. Now let us look at what are the arguments against tribes as indigenous people. B.K. Roy Berman criticized the position of the Indian government on the Convention 107 of the ILO and further proposed the new definition of indigenous people, which has no direct relation to the people categorized as STs. He was strong critic of the composition of very weak representation of B.K. Roy Berman, criticizes the position of the Indian government on the convention. To put it differently, it widens up the debate on who represents the indigenous people. Should the non-indigenous people represent the indigenous community? Who will be able to represent the needs and expectations of indigenous people in an effective and desirable way? In short, he proposes that the interest and rights of indigenous people should be represented by their own members. It is believed that his or her own community than other people would be in a better position to comprehend the problems faced by the indigenous communities, because our interests will be better protected when we are represented by those who share our experience and interest, and this similarity of condition is far better indicated than whether people might share or rather shaking opinions. He further argues that there is a clear Eurocentric bias and even contends that behind the humanistic cover there are global hegemonic forces at work, forces that are trying to undermine the newly independent countries in Asia and Africa. Substantiating his argument about global hegemonic forces, he cited the World Bank's definition of indigenous people, where the World Bank stated that the STs are indigenous people of India, which is a symbol of hegemonic force at work transgressing the sovereignty of India. It has been argued that the definition of indigenous people as original settlers is problematic in the Indian context. Zaxaw acknowledges the conceptual as well as empirical complexity in defining the indigenous people of India. Unlike in America, Australia and New Zealand, with a recent history of conquest, immigration and colonization, identification of indigenous people is not easy in the Indian context. How far back should one go in history to determine the people who are natives and who are immigrants? Indeed, any demarcation is going to be arbitrary and hence extremely contentious. The Indian experience is different from that of the New World, where it was marked by conquest, subjugation and even discrimination. The coming of the Aryans has been invariably taken as the decisive historical factor to determine the indigenous people of India. If we accept this as the cutoff point for defining indigenous people in India, all the tribal communities cannot be considered as indigenous people, because there are tribes in India, especially northeast, whose settlement in the territories they inhabit today is an even later phenomenon than the settlement of many non-tribes in other parts of India. For instance, it is observed that the Nagas believed to have come later than the coming of the Aryans. Andre Bettley in the year 1998 questions the categorization of Indian tribal as indigenous. To him, the designation of any given population in a region as indigenous acquires substance when there are other populations in the same region that can reasonably be described as settlers or aliens. For him, it is extremely difficult to distinguish between tribal and non-tribal population in India due to their coexistence for centuries and millennium. In India, if you look at the history of interaction between tribal and non-tribal population, has been a long and complex one in which both populations have undergone many transformations through usurpation, miscegenation and migration. By the middle of the 19th century, what are called tribes today had on the whole been either subordinated or marginalized economically, politically and socially. The idea of indigenous people must have some basis in the territory inhabited by them in the past and the present. The problem arises when they become dispersed over large areas within and sometimes across national frontiers. In many of the multi-caste agricultural villages of West Bengal, people of tribal origin have come from elsewhere and settled down to work as sharecroppers and agricultural laborers. Their economic and social conditions are for the most part abject and miserable, and they are subject to discrimination and exploitation of the most oppressive kind. But that still does not justify their being described as indigenous people in the context of their present. The Government of India has made both practical as well as policy argument related to the difficulties of indigenous people. Building on the notion of indigenous people as the people who can be first representatives of the Government of India in the working group on the indigenous population have made the practical argument that the concept cannot apply there because after centuries of migration, absorption and differentiation, it is impossible to say who came first. Thus, the Government of India commented that most of the tribes in India share ethnic, racial and linguistic characteristics with other people in the country. The prescription of ethnicity by administrative fiat or self-designation involves numerous problems and is open to much criticism, and there are difficult cases under any approach. It has proved possible as a practical matter to enumerate detailed lists of the STs under the 5th and 6th schedules to the Indian Constitution. These constitutional categories have provided a practical starting point for identification of groups to whom policies of international agencies relating to indigenous people have been applied in India. In relation to the policy argument, the government's position contains an implied argument that a forensic inquiry into who appeared first in India would be unhelpful and undesirable for first, some groups meriting and special protection would be excluded, while others not in need of such protection might be included. Second, recognition of special rights and entitlements for having been the earliest or original occupants might spur and legitimate chauvinist claims by groups all over India, many of which might be very powerful locally when in some sense non-dominant nationality. For instance, Konda Kapus is a group listed as STs in Andhra Pradesh, but not in the neighboring state, that is Orissa. In effect, if some people are indigenous to a place, others are vulnerable to being targeted as non-indigenous, and groups deemed to be migrants or otherwise subject to social stigma may bear the brunt of nativist indigenous policy. Once indigenous or sons of the soil becomes the basis of legitimating for a politically or military dominant group, restraints on abuses of power can be difficult to maintain. In other words, it is extremely difficult and contentious to define the indigenous people in India. India is a melting pot and a country of migration where it is impossible to establish who are the original settlers in a particular place or region are. The term indigenous people is therefore claimed to be inapt on the Indian subcontinent, sometimes with the conclusion that there are no indigenous people in India, or alternatively we can say that all Indians are indigenous. So now to conclude, this unit would help the learner to understand the meaning and characteristics of internationally much debated concept indigenous people. This unit will also help the learner to understand the relationship between some of the selected international bodies such as the ILO, the UN and the World Bank and the indigenous people. This unit will also provide an insight on the debate surrounding the issue of indigenous people in the Indian context, mainly whether the concept of indigenous people at all can be applied in the Indian context. So, it can be stated that the concept of indigenous people does not have any universal understanding, and it has been examined and defined in the respective social context, taking the regional particularities. So, learners, hope you would have understood the unit we have discussed in detail. Thank you.